Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Pulumi for IT Pros. In this course, we're looking at how to use Pulumi, but from a perspective of an IT pro rather than a developer, and learning that perhaps having to write code for our infrastructure as code has more benefits than it does complications. So this week, we are going to carry on from what we did last week, and we are going to start looking at how we actually create infrastructure using Pulumi and in our Python code. So last week, we created a project and we got the default boilerplate deployment, which creates a resource group and a storage account, and we ran that to make sure it worked, and we got some infrastructure deployed. This week we're going to write our own code and we're going to deploy some resources using that code that we've written so that we learn how actually it all hangs together in terms of writing the infrastructure. So if we hop over to VS Code, and hopefully you remember this from last week, we've got our project that we created. In that project, in the folder system, we've got this main.py. That's where our Python code is created, and that's where we're creating the resource group and the storage account and using the outputs to output the storage account key, if you remember all of that. Then we've got some other things within the project that get created for us. We've got a git ignore file, which is just used to help us when we commit this to Git. We've got the YAML configuration file. I mean, if you remember when we created the actual project to ask us for a location, that got stored in here, this West Europe one. The next video, we're going to look at the configuration file in detail. So we're not going to cover that this video. We're not going to use it, but we will start doing that next week, and you'll see how powerful the configuration file can be. But for now, you can just know that's there. And then you've got the Pulumi YAML file, which is just the sort of descriptor of the project and some settings for the project. And then finally, requirements.txt, which just imports whatever Python libraries we need importing using pip. So if we go back to our main.py, and what we're going to do is we are going to get rid of everything. So we're going to start from fresh. We're going to write this from scratch for two reasons. Firstly, obviously, we want to learn, and that's how we're going to get things working. Secondly, I don't like the boilerplate that comes with it, particularly, as I mentioned, it uses that auto name generation piece, which I'm not a fan of. So we will create our own names for resources in this approach. So we left the top bit in, so you can see we're just importing some resources that we're going to consume within our project. So we're importing the Pulumi library. That's just obviously required for all the underlying Pulumi resources. And then we're taking the Pulumi Azure native library, and we're importing the storage and the resources piece. Obviously, if we were going to deploy other resources, then we'll have to import other parts of that library. We'll probably will do that in this session, but we'll leave it at that for now. And so the first thing we want to do is deploy a resource group. That's where all our resources are going to sit. And this is one of the differences between ARM templates and Bicep and things like Pulumi and Terraform. There's not such the same view of scope. So if you wanted to deploy a resource group with a Bicep template, you have to fiddle about with deploying at two different scopes because of the fact that a resource group exists at the subscription scope, but resources exist at the resource group scope. It's a bit of a pain. You can do it, but it is a bit painful. In Pulumi and Terraform, you don't have that distinction, so we can do a resource group and then put things in that resource group very easily. So let's get started and let's see how this Pulumi piece works. You remember I mentioned that actually to deploy resources, you don't really need all that much development experience or knowledge. A lot of the way we create resources is just key value pairs of this property has this value. Not too dissimilar for something like Terraform. They look quite similar. There's just a bit of a wrapper around them to use the programming language. And in the case of Python, we use methods there to do that. So let's see how that works. So the first thing we do with the resource group is we're going to create a variable to store the resource group in. So we'll call that, let's just be simple. Let's call it RG is the variable. You don't have to have a variable. You can just not store the output of the resource group in a variable and just have it nowhere. But obviously that makes it more difficult then later to reference that variable. So you'll find often you will put the result of a particular resource into a variable so you can reference it later. But if you do have resources that are only ever going to get created and never referenced, which is not uncommon, particularly lower level resources, a good example there is probably a role definition. You're going to create the role definition, but nothing else is going to consume that role definition. You don't have to put it in a variable, but we are going to put the resource group in a variable called RG. And then we need to tell it what type of resource it is. So this is coming from that resources library. So this is the name of that there. So we're going to call it resources dot, and then we want a resource. And so we want this resource group option here. And this is a method in Python. So if you're familiar with any programming language, obviously, a method is generally followed with a set of brackets where you pass in any parameters to the method. And you can see from the ItaliCents, we have a few things here. The first one is this resource property, and that's just a string. And this is the name of the resource as far as Pulumi is concerned. This has nothing to do with the name of the resource that gets created in Azure, although you can use the same name if you want to. You can call it whatever you want. This just references what it's called within the state file. So we're just going to call this resource group. You can call it whatever you want. As I say, it doesn't impact what actually gets stored in Azure. And then the next option is these resource options, and these are all the properties that you are passing into the actual resource. So if you're familiar with Bicep or ARM templates, that would be the similar sort of the properties in there. Now, you get some information in the IntelliSense here. The way this is done with Python obviously means you get them all in one lump, which is a little bit hard to read. What you will find is that as you start learning this, you will use the docs quite a lot. So if we hop over to the browser, and we looked at this briefly last week, but this is the Pulumi registry. So if you go to pulumi.com/registry, this is where all the docs are and all the information about the packages. We're using the Azure native package. And if we then go into API docs, we can look for the particular resources. All of the resources are grouped into modules, and the modules are named after the same as what's in the Azure API, what's in ARM templates or Bicep. So resource groups come under resources. So if you look for resources, and then in here you can see resource group. And there is an example in here of what it looks like in every language, and it doesn't have all the properties in the example always. So you can see here, this is just sort of the minimum you have to provide, which is the location and the resource group name. But if you scroll down a bit further, you can then see the other options it takes. So if you look for the inputs here, you can see it also accepts location managed by resource group name and tags. You also get information here on the output. So these are values that when we stick it into that variable, that RG variable, we can then consume that have been emitted from the resource. Okay, and so you'll use these docs quite extensively. I still use them extensively today to get the information about the inputs and the outputs that you might want to use from the resource. So let's hop back to VS Code. Okay, we know from the docs that what we really need to set here, we need to set the name, the location, and we'll perhaps add some tags as well. So if you press Control Space, you get the IntelliSense in Visual Studio Code, and you can see these are all actually listed here as well, the same sort of ones. So we want a resource name option, and we're just going to call this, the resource Pulumi for IT Pros. Match the project, and then you need a comma in Python. Again, the syntax to this will differ depending on what language you're using, but it should all be pretty similar. And then the next one we're going to need is location. So we're going to do that. Get rid of that window. Press escape to do that. And we're going to put West Europe. For the moment, we're hard coding all these values. In the next video, we're going to look at storing them in the configuration file and being able to vary them per environment. So next, we're going to add, so the property name is tags. The tags are slightly different. They're not a string. They are a dictionary. And if you hover over this, you can see there, it's a mapping of string and input string. Now, it's probably worth explaining this for the minute, this input piece, because you might have seen it on other resources. I'm not sure if these show it. Yeah, so if you look at the resource group, it's a type input string as well. Don't worry too much about these. We're going to cover these in a video on their own, but Pulumi has these types called inputs and outputs. They're Pulumi types, and they usually wrap around another type, so like input string here. And these exist because of the way that Pulumi works with infrastructure resources that may or may not exist at different parts in the process. And so we're going to cover this in more detail later, but effectively that's why you're not just using a string, you're using an input string. Now, input strings will accept both a string value, so you can see for a resource group we just put that in there, but they will also accept an input string, which is useful because if we need to pass in values from another resource that was created, so for example here we're creating a resource group, in a minute we're going to take a storage account, we're going to want to use the name of the resource group in the storage account. That comes out of the storage account as an output string. And you can use output strings in values that accept input strings. It's slightly confusing, I know. I'll explain why that is the case later, but that just means that we can use either an actual string or a value that's come from another resource. Try not to worry too much about that, but that's why you see that. So, but in this case, we're looking at ignoring the input bit a minute. It's essentially a mapping or a dictionary of string type. So to define that in Python, again, you can look all these up online if you want to know how to write these things. But in Python, you've got the curly braces, and then you have your key. So we're going to use a key called owner for the tag, and then colon, and then the value. So Sam Kogan as the value. That's one tag. Now, another tag I want to add on here is one called date created. And I could obviously just type the date in as a string, but I don't really want to do that because that obviously will only be valid if I run this today. If I was to deploy this another day, it wouldn't be valid. And this is where one of the benefits we get of using Pulumi, we can use the facilities that are built into the Python programming language. So Python has the ability to get today's date. So we need to import the library. So we're going to do from date time import date. I believe that's right. And so for the date created, we're going to use the date.today function. And I'm also then going to convert it to ISO format. And that's going to go ahead and stick that today's date in ISO format in that tag for us. And that will automatically do that for us whenever we run to deploy this, rather than us having to hard code that and change it every time we run it. So this is just one of the examples where we can use the functionality of the programming language. We don't have to have a special Pulumi get the date function or anything like that. We just use Python's abilities, which is great. So now we've got that set up, let's go ahead and test that and make sure it works. While you're learning, it's probably a good idea just to try testing deployments when you get to a point where you feel like you've achieved something and you want to make sure it works. As you get more confident, obviously, you'll be able to create a load of stuff and then deploy it all in one go. But let's still make sure this resource group works. So go over to the command line. And remember from last time, we're going to run the Pulumi up command. And that should run the Pulumi preview as well. We're going to put our password in and make sure that works. And then we should see this give us a preview, and it's going to create the resource group. And if we have a look at the details, you can see it's going to create that resource group with that Pulumi for IT Pros name. And you can see that it's using today's date as we specified. So let's go ahead and create. And there we go, that's done. And if we hop over to the Azure portal, and we just do a search for IT Pro, we should have that resource group. Yep. And you can see it's got those two tags that we specified. So that has all worked as expected. Let's go back to VS Code. And let's add some more resources. So we're going to add a storage account like we had before, but we're going to walk through how to do that. So again, we want a variable. We're going to put that in. So we're going to call it stg. And this is coming from the storage library up here. So scrolling up rather than the resources one. So we do storage dot storage account is what we want, this one. And I'm going to call that stg again. Remember, that's just the name of the resource in the state file. Doesn't affect what we're calling it in Azure. And then we need some properties in here. So we are going to need an account name. Let's tap that in. And we are going to call it Pro TG01. Let's go with that. Storage names need to be a certain format. They need to be lowercase. They need to be unique. We'll look at how we can programmatically do that later. But for now, we're just going to put that in there like that. We need to define the resource group name that this is going to be deployed into. Now, again, I could just copy and paste this. I could do this. That'll work. But that's going to have a few issues. Firstly, it means we've now got that defined in two places. So if I want to change the resource group name, I'm going to have to change it in two places. But secondly, there's no dependency here between the storage account and the resource group. So if we run this, it's quite likely it might fail because it'll try and create the storage account before the resource group exists. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to get that variable that we stored the resource group in, and it has a name property. So we'll grab that's going to be used in the resource group name. We also need a location. And often that's going to be the same resource group, the same location as the resource group. So we're just going to take that from the resource group and we call it resource group.location. Now for some storage specific stuff. So one thing we need is a SKU to define what type of storage account we want. Now, if we hover over that, SKU is a type of SKU args, ignoring the input piece for the minute, it's SKU args. So if we do storage.SKU args and open brackets, and then the value here we need to set is name. There's only one value. And you can see, and you remember this from last time, the name has a type of that actually supports two types, string or SKU name. So string allows you just to type in the value you want, but SKU name is an enum, so a list of possible values that are supported for this. So if we do that, if we do storage.SKU name, and then it gives us a list of the storage account types. And we want standard LRS. So I can select that without having to remember what the correct text is for the standard LRS value. It'll just sort that out for me. It makes it much easier to select, but also less prone to error. We also need to add the kind. So that defines the sort of type of storage account you get. And again, we're missing a comma there. This is, again, string or the kind type. So we're going to use the kind type. So storage.kind. And these are the values you can get for that. Now, pretty much everyone's going to want to use storage v2. That's the general version you would use now, unless you needed something specific. And lastly, we want to add some tags. So we could just copy and paste and do that like we did with the other one, but that then means it's in two places. So instead, we could do tags equals resource group dot tags, and that'll copy them for the resource group. And again, that will work fine, but that has a slight issue in that this will copy the values from the resource group. So if we deployed the storage account on a different day to the resource group for whatever reason, the date that's copied from here would actually be the date attached to the resource group. We copied over here, and it would be that date. It wouldn't actually match. So what we can do instead is we can again use some of the functionality of Python, and this will also make it easier to read and show that we're reusing a tags object. So we're going to create a variable called tags, and we're going to cut these out here and put them in here. So this variable, this is a Python variable. So this code here is just Python code. It has nothing to do with Pulumi at this point. But we're going to use that then in here and in here. So that will use the same value, but this is separated from the resource group. And so it makes it easy to read, but also the date will be generated at the time the resource is created. So that just makes that a bit simpler. Okay, so that'll create the storage account. And then lastly, what we want to do is we want to create a container within the storage account. But we want to make this slightly more complicated. We want to make this optional. So we're going to create a variable, and we're going to call it create storage container. I'm going to set the value to false. Sorry, to true at this point. We'll change it later and get rid of that extra space. Yeah, so this is a variable. It's got true in it, so it's a Boolean variable. And later on, we're going to look at extracting this out into a configuration file so that we can change that based on the type of environment. At the minute, this value will be used by any deployment that runs this code. So maybe not that useful, but it's a good example of how we can do that. So we've got that variable there. And what we want is we want to do an if statement to define whether or not we create the storage account. And again, this is the advantage of using a real programming language. We just use the functionality that's built into Python. It has nothing to do with Pulumi at that point. It's just Python's if statement. If you've done an if statement in Bicep, you'll know the syntax in that is pretty horrible. And Terraform's not much better either. But for here, we can just do if create storage container, and then a colon is the syntax for an if statement in Python. This is a Boolean value, so obviously we just need that value. If you actually want to do a comparison of strings or something in here, then you would have if a equals b or whatever in there. Press enter, and the syntax for Python's for if statements basically just puts the content of the if statement on a separate line. So we want to then go ahead and create the storage container. Now, I'm not familiar off the top of my head with the syntax for this. So if we hop over to the Pulumi registry API docs for Azure Native, and if we look for storage down here somewhere, yeah, and what we want is a blob container. And so we can see what we're looking for is the blob container option. Now, this is slightly different. This example is slightly different to the one that we're using. So if you remember, we imported the individual libraries for storage and resource group from inside the Azure Native library. Here, they've actually just imported the whole Azure Native library and then using that here. Either option will work. This one obviously has, if you're going to be deploying lots of different resources, it probably makes sense to just do that import once. Whereas if you're only deploying a couple of them, the method we're doing might make it a bit simpler to use. It doesn't really matter, but we can see that we need a blob container. So let's go back and set that up. So we can do storage.blob container. Again, we'll give it a name of container. And then what do we need in here? That's the wrong one. I don't know why it has those in here. So what we want, the one without the underscore in it. Container. Yeah, we want that one. And that should then have, yeah. So we need an account name. This is the name of the storage account that this is going to sit within. So we can just take that from storage.name, I think it is, yep. We need a name for the storage container. So we're just going to call that container 1. And what else have we got that we need to define? A lot of these we don't. We need the resource group name again, so that can come from the resource group. And then let's have a look at one other one. So the public access one is set by default to not be public access, but if you wanted to define it with explicitly in here, you can see that the default value here is set to none, but we'll go ahead and define that anyway, just to be very clear. That's what we're doing, and there we go. That should be it. So we've got our storage container set up. We've got our storage account set up. Let's go and give that a try and see if that actually works. So again, we'll run Pulumi up. And that should be creating the storage account and the storage container. And we can see, yeah, one storage account, and it wants to create a blob container. Because we use the storage account name within the blob container, there's an implied dependency already there. So it should run in the right order, and that should run through, and it should create those resources for us. Yep, so that's finished. That's created those resources. If we hop over to the Azure portal again, and this is the resource group, we hit refresh, we should now have a storage account. Give it a minute. Sometimes it takes a second for it to turn up. There we go. Storage account created. It's in West Europe. It's got those tags that we set up. And if we go to the container thing, we should have that container 1 with private access. That all works as we expected. If we now go back to VS Code, and let's change this create storage container to false, and go back to the command line, and let's run it again. And this should now see that we don't want to create the storage account. Sorry, the storage container. And what it's going to do, it will ask us that we actually want to delete the container. Because Pulumi has in its state file that it has already created that container, and now you've changed your mind and you've removed it, then it wants to remove it for you. And this is one of the nice benefits of having a state-based language, is that it can do this. If you did this in Bicep and you did a deployment after removing a container from the logic, unless you did a complete deployment, which most people don't do, then it wouldn't pick up that the container has been removed, and it would just leave it there. I'm not even sure if a complete deployment would work with that because it's a sub-resource. But anyway, this has picked that up, and so we can say, yes, I do want to delete it. If we'd run it set to false the first time, obviously it wouldn't do that because it hadn't created it in the first place. It would just skip that because it knows it doesn't need to create it. So that's gone ahead and deleted that for us. And we've got a working script here that will create a resource group, a storage account, and a container. We've extracted some of our values for tags and so on. We've used the native language features to create a date time object and to use an if statement on the container. And what you've got here is the very basics of how you deploy resources using Pulumi. In this case in Python, but you can take that to any of the supported languages. And you can get a long way with just what we've shown in this video. You can see you didn't need a massive amount of Python knowledge to do this. As long as you could grasp the syntax for how you create those resources inside that method body. Everything else is just setting up key value pairs effectively with a little bit of looking up specific values for skew and so on in here. So you can go away now, and I recommend you do. Go away and practice. Try out deploying some of the resources that you're interested in using this methodology, and it will, I'm sure, work for you, and you'll be able to get going with deploying whatever you need to. We're going to look at more advanced stuff in the future. Next week, we're going to have a look at the configuration files, so how you can take this and make them more generic and make it easier to deploy new environments using the same code. And we'll add more advanced features. We'll use more features of the languages, and we'll look at some of the more advanced concepts of Pulumi. But what we've done today is really the foundation that should allow you to just go away and deploy some resources, which is the really, the fun bit anyway. So hopefully you enjoyed that. As I say, next week we're going to have a look at configuration. Hopefully I'll see you then. Until then, have a great rest of your day.